When do you need to persist more, and when do you need to just surrender? When are you pushing too hard, and when are you maybe being a little bit too passive? If you've ever been confused about whether you should persist more or longer, or just let go of trying and completely surrender and go into trust, this video is for you. Hello my loves, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Lorena. I'm a somatic self-concept and identity coach, and I support women in bridging the gap between who they currently are or how they perceive themselves and who they desire to be or become, so that you can break even the most persistent, repetitive patterns and cycles that keep repeating in your life. Finally step into the version of yourself that you've always wanted to be and transform your reality. If you ever feel stuck between trying, pushing, forcing, and then again feeling like maybe you should just let go of control and you should just surrender and trust the process, this video will explain to you when the right call is to persist more and when the right call is to just lean back and trust and surrender. Because it's not actually really about choosing one over the other. Persistence and surrender often coexist, but today I'm going to break down what each one really means, because there are a lot of misconceptions around it. We'll dive into where women get stuck and how to know what you need to do in the moment. Let's start with persistence. Now, the idea of persistence, or the popularity of that energy and that word, come from a quote by Neville Goddard, who developed or taught about the so-called law of assumption, who said the phrase, "An assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact." Meaning that if you are persisting in a belief, in an assumption, in a reality that is not your current reality, that is not what is currently true for you, eventually your external world has no choice but to outpicture the assumption or belief that you have persisted in, that you want. Now, on a very basic level, that is true. And I often have a little bit of a problem with Neville Goddard's work, not because it's wrong, but because when it's watered down, it can really keep people trapped or can lead people into delusion rather than operate from embodiment. Because whilst belief and conviction can change so much for you, the downside or the misperception of this statement and of this assumption that when you just persist in an assumption or in a belief long enough, it's going to happen, is that sometimes people misapply this as force. That can often be an unconscious process. That is often not a conscious choice you make. You might, on some level, feel like you need to just believe more. You need to believe really hard. You need to try more. You need to push more. And you might even try to control your circumstances. It can turn really obsessive, whether you want to or not, because you're so preoccupied with it. Now, when you are persisting in this way, you are actually just living in delusion, and you're often creating resistance towards your current reality. Resistance towards anything, a feeling, a state of reality, only makes it louder. It only makes it more prominent, because you're pushing against your experience. You're turning it into a problem. If you've ever felt anxious about something, for example, and then you kind of get down into a spiral of anxiety because you're resisting feeling the anxiety, you just make it worse. Let me know if that example resonates with you. We experience this with emotions, we experience this with states, we experience this with circumstances. When you're pretending something isn't there, but part of your consciousness still knows that it's there, you're not actually living in the reality you want. You're not actually persisting in the assumption that you want to have or embody. You're fighting against your own beliefs, your own psyche. You're fighting against yourself and your reality. The thing is that your consciousness and your subconscious, more so, it knows when you're lying to yourself. And when you're lying to yourself, that's when you're actually staying stuck, because the only person you're trying to prove something to is you. You're not going to get a reward just because you try hard enough. And you can't really trick your subconscious as much as people tell you that you can. As much as you're taught to maybe repeat affirmations until you're blue in the face, because at some point your subconscious will accept it as true. true. It's not a sustainable approach, and it often just makes you fight yourself, and eventually you collapse from it because your body, your nervous system, and your psyche, your emotional body can't really hold it. I'm going to put it this way. If there are parts in you that contradict what you desire to believe, these parts are going to be repressed into your subconscious or in what's called your shadow. So you might not consciously notice that they are there, but they are. And you're likely going to see them outpictured in your reality. That can be through external circumstances, or it can also be through your emotional experience and your reactiveness. That's why self-concept work and an embodied approach to manifestation, which is what I teach, I really want it to be sustainable for you, includes a lot of work with your psyche and your subconscious. In my coaching program, Recreate Yourself, we do a lot of parts work and parts integration and shadow integration, because the goal is really to get every part of you on board with the reality that you desire to call in, so that there's no fragmentation of your consciousness, but you are doing it from a place of embodied wholeness. That is a lot more smooth than trying to push or force. And from that place of embodied wholeness, persistence becomes not something that feels like trying. It becomes something that is just deeply embodied in who you are. It just becomes devotion. Before I dive into what persistence actually is, comparing it to surrender, and then I'll explain to you how to figure out when you need to lean more into one over the other, I want to speak a little bit about the nervous system as well, because I already spoke about how too much persistence or an approach to persistence that's not embodied, it leads to resistance. Now that resistance isn't just mental. It leads to a contraction in your body and in your nervous system. Because think about what resistance feels like. It's not mental, it's something that you feel in your body. You feel like there's a wall coming up, like there's an emotional charge that comes up when you're resisting something. You might feel like you want to pull back. You might feel like you want to reject something. When you're trying to force something or make yourself believe something that doesn't feel true to you, the resistance manifests in your body. Nothing can actually come through when you're contracted because you're not relaxed. You are not receptive in that moment. And that version of persistence can become quite toxic. You don't want to apply manifestation techniques or manifestation principles from a place of control. A version of persistence that is laced with pressure and resistance that leads you to attempt to control your reality or control your state of being, which is the opposite of what's going to create lasting results for you. So what does persistence really mean? Really simply put, it means that you're not giving up. It means devotion. It does mean that you're committed. You are committed to doing what it takes in order to get to your vision, to the future version of yourself that you desire to embody, the future reality that you desire for yourself and that you very much deserve. But that's not force. That's not pressure. It's a getting back up when you fall down. It's not seeing failure as the end, but a sign to do something differently. A sign that the way you've been approaching things up until now isn't what's going to lead you to where you want to go. It's not accepting no for an answer, even when nobody around you believes that you can have what you want, or even when you yourself don't believe that you can have what you want. It's a willingness to take action and not just hope for the best. Now, on the flip side of this, let's talk about surrender. Surrendering and trusting the process is often something that people say they are doing, but what they are really doing is being stuck in waiting, in wishful thinking, in hoping that things will change one day. But they don't really, because they are not doing anything to change things. They are just wishing harder. Just like persistence is also about action, not force, but action. Likewise, surrender isn't about pretending you trust or telling yourself that you trust when actually there's a lot of fear in your system. The trust in the process and in yourself that you experience when you are operating from a true state of surrender, that's embodied, that's not disempowered. And it also doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean you're being passive. It actually is very much active. It's about emotional integration and commitment and devotion, just as much as persistence is. You see where we're headed here when it comes to when to choose either. Now, I feel like I need to give a little bit of a truth bomb here, which isn't always nice to hear, but I see it as my job to interrupt patterns. And I don't want you to operate from the same pattern you've been operating from just because it feels hopeful or nice. I want you to actually experience the reality and the future you want. I want you to actually embody the self-concept you're dreaming of, becoming who you want to be, and not just imagine that one day you will. So I'm going to say this. I often see women and I speak to women who tell me that they are surrendering, that they are trusting the process, that they are trusting that things will change for them soon. Let's say they trust that the money will come in. They trust that an opportunity will open up. And whilst it's amazing to truly trust, often that is not trust. Often that is blind hope or wishful thinking. And I say this because very frequently, let's say 6 months later, I speak to these same women again, and they're in the exact same place they were at before, and they're still telling themselves they trust that things will change. Now, I'm not saying this to discourage anyone. I'm just saying this to call you forward if you are stuck in a pattern. If you recognize yourself in being in the same place that you were in X amount of months or maybe even years ago, although you told yourself things would be different by now. Patterns don't break by you hoping that they will. Patterns don't break by you doing things the way you've always done them. You need to be able and willing to do things differently. And as a coach, I see it as my duty to call you out on this, to call you out on your patterns. Now, there's a false binary when it comes to persistence versus surrender because it's not actually a contradiction. When you are embodied in the self-concept that is aligned with the reality you want, you are both in devotion and persistence because you are so aligned with your vision, but you're also in deep trust and surrender. There's no force. So there's no contradiction between the two. It's not really a matter of am I trying, am I taking action, am I focused on my vision, or am I surrendering and receiving? It's actually the same thing because it's two sides of the same coin, which is your embodiment, your state of being, your identity. Now you may wonder, how do I help someone recognize if they are forcing, if their version of persistence is pushing too hard versus when they're actually embodying that true surrender? Like, what's a sign that you can look for? Now, this is something that I move through frequently with my clients because it can be hard to determine, right? And it is really an individual process. But what I can tell you is that I usually get two types of clients. Either the client who is more focused on doing more, doing more, doing more. They're often in what's called a fight response. I have a whole video series about the different nervous system states and how they apply to manifestation. So I recommend you check that out. I'm going to link it in an info card above my head. But that first type of client is very much used to always taking action, trying to make things happen, can sometimes be a bit controlling or forceful, trying to do more, trying to control her circumstances. Now, this type of client needs to learn to lean more into surrender, which is the exact opposite of what she wants to do. Because your default is what feels comfortable to you or what feels natural to you. So for this type of client, actually fully surrendering and ending up in that embodiment and in that deep trust is very challenging. I'm that type of person too, by the way. I am someone who would always find it a lot more challenging to just surrender and to just let things flow. I'm very much a doer. So I need to work on this constantly also. But what I will work on with this type of client is very much their nervous system state, their habitual nervous system state, so that they can create safety in the being, that they can create safety in the receiving, in the rest, so that they can feel safe not doing anything. That's also why it is so important for this work to know your nervous system inside out, recognize what state you're in at what time, to recognize what your go-to pattern and state of being is. So the two things that I really teach my clients, because I want them to become self-led and self-empowered in this also, is to, number one, rewire their habitual nervous system state, which is something that we do together in Recreate Yourself. And that is so that they have more power in their state of being and their reality. And the second thing I teach them is to really recognize the nuances in their own nervous system, in their own state of being, so that they know themselves when to take action, what action to take, and when it's better to just lean back and hold back and let things unfold. And that second type of client that I wanted to speak about is the type of woman who's a bit too surrendered, right? So for example, when someone leans a bit too much into trusting the process, which is kind of the example that I gave earlier about the women that I often speak to, for example, in my Instagram DMs, what I really mean is they're in waiting. They are kind of in a state where they just don't take any action. They don't do anything. They're actually not moving towards their vision, towards the future they want. They're really just hoping for the best. Maybe the work they do doesn't have enough depth. Maybe they've dabbled in therapy, but the emotional integration is lacking. Maybe they've tried to resolve everything through doing a few techniques, or maybe they're just bullshitting themselves by telling themselves they trust when they're actually in fear or in disbelief. So that type of client or that type of woman tends to be the type of person who, as a coping mechanism, goes more into what's called a freeze response. Again, I have the series about the nervous system. But that type of woman or that type of client tends to find it difficult to take action in the first place. When they feel overwhelmed, they just pull back. And that client really needs to learn to charge forward, to create more commitment and devotion, to take the right aligned actions. And although I've now said there are these two types of clients, because we all have a tendency to lean more into one direction, obviously there's nuance to this as well. We don't fit neatly into a box, right? It fluctuates depending on circumstances, depending on your past, depending on who you are in this moment, but we tend to belong into one field more. Let me know which field you tend to belong to more. Do you lean more towards trying to do more, maybe push, force, do more techniques, apply more routines? Or do you tend to be the person who goes more into defeat and waiting, possibly under the guise of surrender? I do also have a free masterclass series which goes a lot more deeply into both persistence and surrender. I've linked it below in the description, so you are welcome to dive in to get even more detail on this. If you're now hearing all this and you recognize, I have actually been feeling very stuck, I've been going in circles, I've been telling myself, oh, I'll persist, but then I go back to my old identity, or I'm telling myself I've surrendered and I'm trusting the process, but in all actuality, I'm just waiting for something to change, and I'm not empowered, I'm not really taking charge of my reality, then what do? How do you move on from that? Now, there are several things that you can do. First of all, by acknowledging this, you're already taking an amazing step, because a lot of people will just lie to themselves. They'll pretend that what they're doing right now is the right thing just because they want it to be, but they actually stay in wishful thinking. It is very important to take responsibility for your state. The second thing you want to do is to ask yourself, where do I want to go? What is my vision? And then connected to that vision, what would that version of me who lives that vision, what would that version of me do? How would that version of me respond to my current state of being, to my current life? If I was already that person, most likely that person wouldn't just stay stuck in waiting. That version of you would probably take action to change the situation they're in. And obviously that depends on what the vision is. Maybe it's I'm going to start dating when you realize you've just been waiting for Prince Charming to knock on your door and you've not actually done anything to meet the man of your dreams or the person of your dreams. Or maybe it's I'm going to ask for support because I'm done doing this by myself. Maybe it's I'm going to hire a coach that's going to help me get clear on my patterns and establish what's actually going on in my psyche and work through the emotional charges to embody a different self-concept. The most important thing is that you are not bypassing your truth. that you're not lying to yourself, but that you're actually beginning to do something differently. Because the one thing that is going to continue to keep you stuck is not doing anything at all. The reason you keep recycling the same patterns, the same emotional cycles, the same circumstances, the same states of being, and the same old identity is because you keep doing things the way you've always done them, and yet you're hoping that something will change. Nothing will change if you don't change. Let me know how this video resonated with you. If you liked it, please do leave a like. It does help. Please subscribe if you want more of this. If you want to work with me, if you want to do the work to transform your self-concept and fully liberate yourself from your patterns and fully embody a new reality and version of yourself, then you can check out my coaching program, Recreate Yourself, which I've got linked in the description box below. And then I hope to see you next week again, where we will dive into the role that boundaries have when it comes to your self-concept and the other way around.